Today's society is different. And when we talk about difference, we need to look around. We used to see decades ago buildings that were more and more simple, without ornaments and carrying a universal meaning. But today, we see artists that design and architects that design unconventional buildings. Sometimes when you look at such a building, you have a question: is this building reliable? Can I live in it? And what is the message that this building sends out? We have to conclude that the meanings and the interpretations have changed. Sometimes we visit a museum and we are surprised to see that artists are experimenting with representations of people. Sometimes in a museum you might be shocked to find a urinal. And still, this is an art museum. We look around on the street and we see families. But the families that we are used to seem to be more diverse today, different. What shall we do with this difference? Today, we are talking about a contemporary society, but we are talking about a pluralist society. We talk about postmodern society, and we also talk about secular society. Which one is the one that you live in? How can you identify that? Let's look at a short definition of these terms. A secular person does not believe in God. A pluralist may believe in many gods or many paths to truth. A contemporary person is someone who lives at the present time. And a postmodern individual is far more complex. A postmodern can be a secular, a pluralist, and a contemporary person. Let's try to illustrate the differences between these three categories. In the pre-modern era, the reality was explained in terms of far off, supernatural, transcendence. Just read Psalm 8. The heavens declare the glory of God. The heavens out there, transcendence. So, a good symbol for the pre-modern era is a telescope with which you scrutinize far off. But then, in the modern era, since the Enlightenment on, we can use the symbol of a microscope, because reality is observable, but it is also dissectable and explainable. Remember what one French philosopher said: "I think, therefore I am." This is Descartes. So the modern era is characterized by a microscope. But we move on to the postmodern era. What do we see here? An ever-changing mosaic of pieces of broken glass that is beautiful when light shines through it. You may have recognized Erwin McManus' description of a kaleidoscope. Remember, not a microscope, not a telescope, but now a kaleidoscope, where the reality is evolving and is understood through brokenness and interrelationships between the pieces. So today, we have to think in terms of a kaleidoscope. We have to look through the kaleidoscope to see beauty, to see from all the differences a big picture. But we will talk more about this later. What triggered the change? Why did we change from the pre-modern to postmodern? First of all, modernism, and I will start from there, aimed to improve the lives of people using science and logic. Humanity seemed to have a bright future. but during the First World War, science was used to creating weapons of mass destruction, killing on an industrial scale. After such an experience, people became pessimists. Hope that humanity might become better faded. World War II brought two main events that killed practically the idea of the goodness of people and amplified suspicion of science and logic. The first was the Holocaust, and the second was dropping of the atomic bomb on the Japanese islands. After the Second World War, people thought there is nothing good in humanity. Let's try to compare the modern and the postmodern worldviews to see where the differences started and why do we see a different world today. Under the modern worldview, people thought that they need to conquer and control everything. The mindset was a mechanistic mindset, the law and the result, the effect. The type of thinking was analytical, and everything was viewed from a secular scientific perspective. That is why people in the modern era talked about knowing God, from the outside, looking at God. But in the postmodern era, what we see today, we see conservation, no longer conquest and control. We see a focus on the organic and the ecological. Everything brought together, everything allowed to grow and to function in its own right. Instead of a strictly analytical perspective, we see now a holistic perspective, where emotions, passions can contribute to the big picture. We no longer have a secular scientific view, but we have a spiritual scientific view. Spirituality is coming back. Although not necessarily religion as we know it, but spirituality is again on the agenda of many people. And today, instead of simply knowing God and knowing about God, today people talk about experiencing God. Let me mention some values, both in modernity and postmodernity. The modernity emphasized excellence. In religious terms, in worship, everything had to be planned ahead of time. Everything had to be the best. Professionals were part of the religious experience. But in postmodern values, performance is no longer aimed at, but now you want the gathering, you want relationship, you want emotions. And you may see people in worship raising their hands and waving and closing their eyes and trying to experience worship. Another modern value was the cognitive and conceptual learning through one-way preaching. The preacher was up front and the listeners just did that. I remember when I grew up in my grandparents' church in a city where there were many Germans. In the church, you are not even allowed to say amen. Your role was to sit and listen, and the preacher would preach. But today, in postmodern experiential encounter, you have interactive teaching, you have participation through senses. It's a different approach and a different set of values. In modernity, we had absolute truth. But in postmodernity, we are faced with a plurality of truth. We are talking about individual truth. Sometimes in modernity, we had the removal of the ancient or spiritual. But today, people are looking back and they desire to discover their roots, to know the history, and to discover the supernatural again. The supernatural is no longer kept out, but the supernatural is invited. People want to experience it. And finally, one modern value that I would like to mention is when we talk about religion, we are going to church. But in postmodernity, the church is going out. In both senses, people are no longer coming to church, but the church itself needs to go out into the world. I think you notice the difference in approach, the difference in worldview, and the difference in what people are looking for based on their different values. Today, society is plural. We no longer deal with one truth, absolute truth, but we deal with many truths, many experiences, many approaches to life, many views on life. I mentioned enlightenment. Enlightenment elevated humankind and the individual to the center of the attention. You, as the individual, was supposed to be the king or the queen. Everything that was out there was doubted. Modern thinking questioned everything. The assumption was that knowledge needs to be acquired, but knowledge is certain. Knowledge is objective. Knowledge is good. In the modern worldview, progress seemed inevitable. Science and education brought freedom from vulnerability to nature or to social bondage. We had liberation movements. We had all kind of freedom from something. There was an absolute faith, but not in God. There was an absolute faith in human rational capacities. So, as a conclusion, modernism was an optimistic worldview. Everything seemed bright. They were looking to the future. Everything was better in the future. In contrast, what we see today in postmodernism, we see suspicion of classical notions of truth, reason, identity, objectivity, even to the idea of universal progress or emancipation. We see postmodernism being suspicious of single frameworks of interpretation or of grand narratives. And finally, postmodernism is suspicious of ultimate ground of explanation. The question why is a big word in the postmodern vocabulary. This question forces people to look at the underlying reasons that govern a particular action. Results are not enough. So what we are looking at is a hermeneutics of suspicion and an epistemology of uncertainty. Sounds strange, but this is a worldview that denies all other worldviews. Postmodernism does not believe in absolute truth. Truth belongs to the group. It is actually the meaning that the group provides, even to the words that we use. So we are faced with a fluid cultural field. A fluid cultural field by nature is eclectic. It's not amenable to systematic statements or to very sharp definitions. That is why you may see books today titled Liquid Church. Even the church needs to be fluid. So postmoderns relentlessly question the underlying moral values, the assumptions, the principles, and the worldviews that drive the world today, especially when it comes to religious structures. Many are questioning the biblical story of Jesus. You may have heard about the Jesus Seminar or the quest for historical Jesus. They are trying to find out what was real from the biblical story and what was not. Today you see books or movies like the Da Vinci Code, or the Lost Gospel of Judas, or the Lost Tomb of Christ. Everything seems to be lost or not included in the biblical account, and everything now comes to the fore with full force as being truth. The hub of postmodern life strategy is not making identity stand, but they try to avoid being labeled with a certain identity. They don't want to be fixed. So there are no universal rules or standards, just a multitude of those. No single standard or set of standards is universally accepted as binding on everyone. So we talk about moral norms that vary from culture to culture and are determined by social setting or environment. I'm reminded of a cartoon that shows that there is no right way, no wrong way, simply your way. We are talking about relativism here. When we talk about pluralism, relativism comes to the fore. Knowledge is no longer considered inherently good. Its objectivity is denied. Knowledge is good but not certain. Progress is rejected. Nothing is evolving. Everything is recycling. Have you heard the word these days? The speed of spinning is faster and faster, leading to overlapping events, everything happening at the same time. The world seems to have reached a point of no return. Enlightenment's optimism has been replaced with a profound pessimism. Those who still want to pursue their own dream are free to do it, but it's at their own risk. For postmoderns, truth is no longer solely rational. It can also be acquired through intuition and emotion. There is no absolute truth for postmoderns. Truth has become dependent on the understanding and perception of the community. Truth is actually what works for the well-being of that particular group or community. When you look at relativism, this impacts the postmodern community. Postmodern individuals feel alone, abandoned, alienated, estranged from the family, from community, even from God, and often from self. They also feel they can trust no one, sometimes not only themselves. Postmoderns feel like they have been cheated by the government, by the economy, by their families, by previous generations, in many ways. They don't have a lot of faith in institutions, either political or religious or maybe financial. They see the world through a cloud of cynicism and skepticism. And as you go, you move on the street, you hear and you see cynicism and skepticism. To postmoderns, religion is relative. Friends, home, school, media, they have a greater influence on their lives than religion has. They are interested, very interested in spiritual things, but are not necessarily interested in Christian concepts. They are not resistant to the concept of God. They are resistant to the Christian church that preaches a certain God. For them, the church is separatist, segregated, institutional, irrelevant, judgmental, holier than you, controlling, and very authoritarian. Postmoderns see Christianity as a divisive faith. They are culturally sensitive, and they want to break down all barriers and dividing lines. At least, this is what they affirm. What is real to postmoderns is what they experience. And what they want to experience is a sense of community, pluralism. Today we are talking about an emergent movement. And in religion and theology, in Christianity, we are looking at emergent churches. What do these churches do different than the others? Following the postmodern philosophy, they deconstruct, they reconstruct, and then they redefine Christianity. They claim that something good has to start with the chaos. They think that As God created out of chaos in Genesis 1, we need to do the same today in order for God to say, it is good. Is it good? For us who would like to talk to people today, to share the gospel, this raises a huge challenge. Because postmoderns tend to have what we call a syncretistic spirituality. That is a kind of religion that you build yourself. You take from here, you take from there, you put pieces together, and you create your own religion. Sometimes Christians preached against other religions or against other Christian denominations. Let me advise you, it's not the place for apologetics with postmoderns. Don't try to fight or to prove others wrong. Postmoderns will leave you alone. Proving Christianity better than, let's say, Islam or Hinduism is seen as intolerance for such a diversity-sensitive postmodern. Churches and denominations that fail to live out the community of love found in the New Testament are part of the reason postmodernists are disinterested in institutional Christianity. Missionaries, educators, ministers need to sit down with postmodern people and listen and learn from them. Should I repeat this? Missionaries, educators, ministers have to sit down with postmodern people and first of all listen and learn from them. If I may remind you of the best method to win people, first you have to mingle with people and listen to them and earn their trust. These are the first steps to be taken with postmoderns. When discussing spiritual issues with postmoderns, remember that the most helpful thing is to focus on Jesus. Okay, what shall we do with the Old Testament? What shall we do with all the other passages that do not have Jesus? Well, this is where our creativity has to be brought into the picture, so we can discover Jesus even in the Old Testament and the rest of the Scripture. Postmoderns will identify intimately with the suffering of Jesus. Read to them Isaiah 53, for example. Explain to them Isaiah 53, and you will see how they can relate to people and to suffering. People are not going to listen to your words as much as they are going to observe your life. How do you cope with suffering? How do you deal with issues in life that they may have to deal with? That is why it is very strategic to develop a relationship with them. Jesus mingled with people. Jesus listened to them, empathized with them, earn their trust. A relationship means to earn their trust. We must learn to let the Bible speak through our lives. We must demonstrate to this new generation that we welcome them into our churches, schools, and ministries so they can explore who Jesus is as they watch and observe how we worship, how we serve, and how we seek to follow Jesus in our lives. Remember that postmoderns, although pessimistic, they appreciate the enthusiasm and sincerity of true Christians. That means honesty is very important. We must find ways to express the Christian faith so the postmodern generation can experience it. This may mean, again, innovation, creativity, to be released and encouraged to pursue new venues for expressing the good news to a generation that is hungry for it. As Christians, our task may be to provide the pieces, the materials, the resources out of which a new world can be imagined. And remember that postmoderns like the kaleidoscope to bring all these pieces in their way to create a new image. It might not necessarily look like a coherent system to you, but it will rather be like a life puzzle put together in new configurations. Remember, a kaleidoscope. Someone said that to a deconstructed horse, you should give deconstructed water to drink. That means you have to adapt the food to the consumer. It is important to Christian experience and for them to experience the angst of these people. Remember, to identify with them, to live the incarnational model, we have to experience what they experience. To try to live in that type of chaos or nihilism sometimes and see, can something good come out of it? Unless we feel the brokenness of other people, it's unlikely that we will be able to present the gospel to them as good news. Let me present to you 4 R's for communicating to postmoderns. Postmoderns have a language and a background quite different from the previous generations. Not only terminology is different, but the meanings of the words have changed. First R, communication has to be real. To be real means to be vulnerable, transparent, and sometimes imperfect. It is something close to being raw. If you are real, they will identify with you. The second R, communication has to be rousing. Postmoderns are full of paradoxes. They expect realness from others, but the fact that they are hiding implies that they are being less than real themselves. One reason they find such authenticity appealing is because it is a quality that they aspire to. Your communication has to rouse their interest. The third R, communication with postmoderns has to be relevant to their generation. They want to know if the Bible is still relevant today. They want to know if it still works in someone's life. If we do not have examples in our own lives, it will be very difficult to convince them. What is relevant for them is our experience and the truth working in our experience. And the fourth R means relational. Communication has to be relational. Postmoderns are eager to learn how to relate to each other because that is a life skill that they frequently had little contact with as they grew up. They want to avoid the pitfalls they saw their parents blunder into. The gospel is going to be communicated more incarnationally than propositionally or cognitively. We do have 28 fundamentals. We know we have the truth. But how can we transform, live this truth incarnationally, rather than affirm it propositionally or cognitively only? Let me end with a summary here. A 4R message. Communication has to be real, has to be rousing, has to be relevant, and has to be relational. Do not rush. Do not expect conversions immediately. Do not expect people to embrace your perspective. Just be patient. Postmoderns need time to process information, to process their feelings, and to process their perceptions. We are all actually in the process. We do not have all the answers. And by the way, none of us have arrived at the end of the road. When we identify with postmoderns and with people living in pluralist societies in this way, we will be part of the picture. We will be part of the kaleidoscope, and our experience will be part of the big experience. I wish you'll join me in this journey.